If you're looking for the best adventure games on Nintendo Switch and Switch 2, you found the right place. We're counting down 25 absolute bangers, from open-world RPGs to sci-fi epics. Let's get into it. No Man's Sky had a rough launch back in 2016, but Hello Games turned it into one of the most ambitious space games ever made. What you get now is a full survival sandbox where you explore procedurally generated planets, build bases, farm resources, craft ships, and dig into a surprisingly deep, lore-driven story about a mysterious signal called the Atlas. The universe is practically infinite, and no two planets are the same. You land on a frozen world, then warp to a toxic swamp planet, then find a paradise moon with 6 rings in the sky. The gameplay loop is about exploration, progression, and survival. You upgrade your exosuit, starship, and multi-tool, and the deeper you go, the more layers open up. There's base building, underwater exploration, a full freighter system, multiplayer, and story missions that actually have weight to them. On Switch 2, No Man's Sky runs at 1080p handheld at 40 frames per second with VRR and DLSS, and 1440p docked at 30 frames per second. It's a massive upgrade from the original Switch version, which barely hit 30 frames per second at 720p. PRAGMATA. You play as Hugh, a space engineer stranded on the moon after a catastrophic event, and you team up with Diana, a small android girl with mysterious abilities. The two of them have to fight their way back to Earth, and their dynamic is at the core of everything. The gameplay mixes real-time combat, hacking mechanics, and puzzle solving in a way that constantly keeps you thinking. Hugh handles the shooting and heavy lifting, while Diana can interact with the environment and hack systems to open paths or disable enemies. The combat feels snappy and satisfying, especially when the mechanics click together. The RE engine does its thing with striking visuals and great animation. On Switch 2, the game targets 60 frames per second and mostly hits it in interior areas and controlled spaces, dipping into the 30s to 40s in dense exterior scenes. The internal resolution sits around 540p, docked with DLSS upscaling to 1080p. Dragon's Dogma: Dark Arisen is an open-world action RPG set in a fantasy world where a dragon literally rips out your heart, and instead of dying, you become an Arisen, a chosen warrior with the power to command pawns, AI companions that follow your orders in battle. The pawn system is the big thing here. You create a main pawn and customize them completely, and then hire 2 others from other players' saves online. Your pawns learn from battles, remember monster weaknesses, and grow with you throughout the game. The combat is physical and weight-based. You can grab enemies, climb onto giant bosses, hang on as they try to shake you off, and land targeted strikes. Vocations like Strider, Warrior, Sorcerer, and Assassin all play very differently, and you can mix and match augments across classes. The story has a slow burn that pays off surprisingly hard near the end. Dark Arisen adds the full Bitter Black Isle expansion, which is essentially a brutal late-game dungeon. You probably already know what Skyrim is, but it keeps showing up on every platform because it genuinely holds up. You're the Dragonborn, a warrior destined to stop an ancient dragon from destroying the world. The main story is solid, but the real pool is everything else. Hundreds of side quests, 5 massive guild storylines, a huge world full of caves, forts, ruins, and towns to explore, and a character build system that lets you be anything you want. Want to be a stealthy archer who talks their way out of every fight? Do it. Want to be a pure mage who summons an army and lets them handle everything? Also fine. The freedom is the whole point. The Switch version of Skyrim Anniversary Edition runs at 30 frames per second on Switch 2, with 4K resolution docked via DLSS from a 1440p base and 1080p handheld. The Switch 2 update bumps up grass density, draw distance, shadow quality, and adds volumetric fog and depth of field.
Good luck. I wouldn't have made it without your help today.
Kingdom Come: Deliverance. You're Henry, the son of a blacksmith in 15th century Bohemia, caught in the middle of a civil war after your village gets burned down and your parents are murdered. What follows is a grounded, realistic medieval sim where you have to learn how to fight, read, pick locks, brew potions, and talk to people without coming off like an idiot. Skills literally improve by doing them repeatedly. Early in the game, you are genuinely bad at sword fighting, and you'll lose most encounters until you put in the hours to master the directional combat system. The combat is one-on-one focused and timing heavy in a way that feels different from most action games. The world is dense with politics, personal stories, and moral decisions that don't have clean answers. The Royal Edition includes all DLC chapters, making this a meaty package. The first Kingdom Come also got a free 60 frames per second patch on PS5 and Xbox in early 2026. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is machine games doing what they do best, but instead of Wolfenstein, it's indie. Set between Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade, this is a globe-trotting first-person adventure where you follow Indiana Jones as he investigates a mystery connecting ancient sites across the world: Egypt, Italy, Vatican City, Thailand, and more. The gameplay mixes stealth, exploration, and combat, with a heavy emphasis on using your whip, your fists, and improvised environmental objects over guns. The level design rewards exploration, and the puzzles fit naturally into the adventure tone without ever feeling like homework. The Switch 2 version runs at a locked 30 frames per second with 1080p docked and 720p handheld, both via DLSS. Machine Games confirmed they chose 30 frames per second to ensure stability and quality parity with other consoles. Ray-traced global illumination is fully intact on Switch 2, which is genuinely impressive.
Behind the Great Circle, from the pyramids of Giza to the sunken temples of Sukhothai and beyond, use your wits to infiltrate historic areas and solve fiendish...
Tears of the Kingdom picks up where Breath of the Wild left off, and immediately raises the ceiling of what an open-world game can do. Link gets new abilities: Ultra Hand, Fuse, Ascend, and Recall, and the entire game is built around combining them in ways the developers probably didn't even think of. The Ultra Hand ability lets you grab objects and stick them together, so players build flying machines, boats, tanks, and launchers using the materials they find in the world. Every problem in this game can be solved in multiple creative ways, and that freedom is what makes it special. The story goes deeper into Hyrule's ancient history and introduces a villain that actually feels threatening. The Sky Islands add a whole new vertical layer to exploration, and the underground depths are their own massive world. On Switch 2, Tears of the Kingdom runs at 4K docked, upscaled from 1440p and 1080p handheld, both at 60 frames per second with HDR. Fantasy Life I is Level 5's Life Sim RPG, and it's much deeper than it looks. You play a character who gets transported to a mysterious island after a girl steals time itself, causing the world to freeze. The game blends classic fantasy RPG combat and exploration with a full life system. You can pick up professions called lives, which include paladin, wizard, hunter, woodcutter, tailor, angler, cook, and more. Each life has its own progression system and affects how you interact with the world. A woodcutter chops trees to get materials. A cook uses those materials to craft meals that buff your party. A tailor turns cloth into armor. The game encourages switching between lives and building toward your own playstyle. The combat is real-time and approachable, and the story is light and fun without being childish. The island itself is big and packed with content: gathering, crafting, quests, relationship building, and seasonal events. Metroid Prime Remastered is not just a coat of paint on a 20-year-old game. Retro Studios rebuilt this thing from the ground up in terms of visuals, controls, and presentation. You play Samus Aran, a bounty hunter investigating a distress signal on a ruined space station that leads you to the planet Talon 4, a world overrun by mutated creatures and an alien parasite called Phazon. The gameplay is first-person exploration, with a focus on scanning the environment to build lore, solving puzzles with different beam weapons and suit upgrades, and fighting boss encounters that test how well you understand your abilities. The world design is interconnected and opens up as you gain new tools, which is the heart of the Metroidvania structure. What makes this version stand out is how clean it feels to play in 2023. The modern dual-stick controls feel natural, and the game never loses its atmosphere. It still feels isolating, tense, and rewarding. Mina the Hollower is a top-down action-adventure set in a gothic horror world where you play Mina, a mouse-like engineer who digs underground to avoid danger and navigate levels. The burrowing mechanic is the main hook. You duck under the earth to dodge attacks, travel quickly, and find hidden items. Above ground, you fight with a whip-style weapon and collectible tools that behave like the sub-weapons in classic Castlevania. The game is challenging but fair, with tight controls and level design that rewards memorization. The monster designs lean into classic horror archetypes: werewolves, ghosts, undead knights, but with a warm and stylized art direction that keeps things from feeling oppressive. The boss fights are some of the best in the genre, with patterns that test everything you've learned. On Switch, runs at a locked 60 frames per second. On Switch 2, it hits 120 frames per second. That level of responsiveness at 120 frames per second is genuinely rare and makes every input feel instant. The Witcher 3 on Switch 1 hovers around 20 frames per second in demanding areas, and the resolution was rough. On Switch 2, without even a dedicated patch, the game runs at a stable 30 frames per second, with noticeably improved dynamic resolution across both docked and handheld. You play Geralt of Rivia, a monster hunter for hire in a war-torn fantasy world, searching for his adopted daughter Ciri, who's being hunted by a spectral army called the Wild Hunt. The main quest is one of the best written narratives in gaming, and the side quests, especially the ones that feel like small short stories, are often better than the main story of other RPGs. The world is dense with political tension, folklore-inspired monsters, and characters who feel like real people with real problems. The combat blends swordplay, magical signs, alchemy, and potions in a way that gets more satisfying as you upgrade. Two massive expansions, Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, add tens of hours of equally brilliant content.
Did he know they eat the living as well?
No. Really upset him too. His theory collapsed.
Sea of Stars follows two children of the solstice, Zale and Valir, who are trained warriors capable of using the power of sun and moon to fight the creations of a mad alchemist called the Fleshmancer. The combat system is the big draw here. It's turn-based, but with timed hits. Press the button at the right moment and your attack does extra damage, or your defense blocks more. Enemies have breakable combos that you can interrupt by hitting specific elements in a sequence, which adds a constant puzzle layer to every fight. No random encounters. Enemies are visible in the world, and you choose your battles. The world is gorgeous, built in a high-resolution pixel art style with full 3D lighting. And the exploration includes puzzles, sailing, fishing, and a world that opens up gradually. The story pulls off a tone shift midway through that genuinely surprised people. On Switch, Sea of Stars runs at 60 frames per second at 1080p docked and 720p handheld, one of the cleanest performers on the hardware. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. You play Shulk, a young researcher on the Bionis, a massive titan that serves as a continent who discovers the Monado, a legendary sword with the power to see the future. What starts as a revenge story against the Mechon machines that attacked his home evolves into something much bigger and more philosophical. The combat is real-time but tactical. You position your party, use arts on cooldown timers, set up combos with your allies, and use Shulk's future vision to cancel incoming enemy attacks. The world is one of the best in any RPG. Each region is visually distinct and rewards exploration with collectibles, hidden areas, and side quests that flesh out the world's lore. On Switch 1, the Definitive Edition runs at 1080p docked and 720p handheld at a mostly stable 30 frames per second, with some minor drops in larger outdoor areas. On Switch 2, the game benefits from a full 60 frames per second upgrade. Trails in the Sky, First Chapter. You play Estelle Bright and her adopted brother Joshua as they train to become Bracers, a guild of protectors who take on jobs for ordinary people across the kingdom of Librel. What begins as a road trip adventure gradually pulls them into a political conspiracy that threatens their entire homeland. The story stays faithful to the original, but the remake brings it to life with full voice acting in English for the first time, gorgeous 3D environments, and a completely modernized combat system. Battles blend real-time field action with a deeper turn-based command battle mode, where you position characters on a grid, use arts powered by an orbment system similar to Final Fantasy VII's Materia, and manage turn order strategically. Every NPC in the world gets updated dialogue after major story beats, and quality-of-life additions like fast travel and quest markers make exploration smooth without removing any depth. On Switch 2, the game offers two modes, 4K at 30 frames per second or 1080p at 60 frames per second, both docked.
We'll end this in no time.
Pokémon Scarlet and Violet marked a major shift for the franchise. Fully open world, no loading zones, go anywhere from the start. You are a student in Paldea, a Spain-inspired region, with 3 story paths to tackle in any order: gym challenges, Team Star, and Titan Pokémon. All 3 converge into a shared ending that hit harder than most expected. The Let's Go mechanic lets your Pokémon auto-battle in the overworld, cutting down on grinding. On Switch 1, this game ran terribly, regularly dropping below 30 frames per second, sometimes closer to 20 frames per second in busy outdoor areas. On Switch 2, a free update on launch day, June 5th, 2025, fixed all of that. Docked, it now renders at 1080p and upscales to 4K via DLSS, targeting 60 frames per second, mostly holding it with minor dips in open areas. Handheld goes from shaky sub 720p to a dynamic 648p, scaling to 1080p, also at 60 frames per second. Load times are drastically faster, and Pokémon draw distance is noticeably better. Finally runs the way it should have at launch. Dragon Quest VII Reimagined. The story is about a world where the only land left is a single island. Everywhere else has been erased. Your character and his friends discover stone tablets that transport them to the past, where they can restore lost lands by helping the people who lived there before a dark force consumed them. Each land you restore is essentially a self-contained story, a town dealing with a curse, a civilization destroyed by betrayal, a community living under a tyrant. And these mini-arcs are often incredibly moving. The tone switches between lighthearted adventure and genuinely bleak tragedy in ways that stick with you. The class system lets you build characters across dozens of vocations, including monster-specific classes you unlock by collecting monster hearts. On Switch 2, Dragon Quest VII Reimagined targets 60 frames per second at enhanced resolutions, making one of the longest JRPGs ever made finally feel modern. Monster Hunter Stories 3. You play as the heir of Azuria, a kingdom facing an environmental catastrophe called crystal encroachment, which is warping monsters into violent, altered states. You team up with Eleanor, the princess of the rival kingdom of Vermeil, to investigate and stop the threat. Monsters are collected as eggs, hatched, and raised as monsty companions that fight alongside you in turn-based battles. Combat uses a rock-paper-scissors style system of power, speed, and technical attacks, and you need to read your enemy's patterns and respond with the right move type to gain advantages. Genes collected from monsters can be transferred to your monstie to customize their stats and abilities. The world is open and filled with nesting grounds, rare monsters, and exploration rewards. On Switch 2, the game targets 30 frames per second, with the frame rate hovering in the 25 to 40 range, depending on scene complexity. Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. You play a high school student in modern-day Tokyo who falls into a desert wasteland called the Empyrean, merges with a divine being called Aogami, and becomes a Nahobino, a half-demon being caught between warring factions of gods, demons, and humans. The world is post-apocalyptic, the atmosphere is oppressive, and the story asks heavy questions about free will, creation, and what it means to be human. The combat is the hardest thing to put down once it clicks. Every battle is turn-based and built on the press turn system. Hit an enemy's weakness and you gain extra turns. Miss or get your weakness hit and you lose them. Fusing demons from your collection to create stronger ones, with inherited skills of your choosing, is endlessly satisfying. On Switch 2, the experience is noticeably smoother, with faster load times, better resolution stability, and less hitching during exploration and cutscenes. Still, targets 30 frames per second, but the experience is much cleaner. Split Fiction is a co-op-only action platformer from Hazelight, the studio that made It Takes Two, and it goes even bigger. You play Mio and Zoe, two aspiring fiction writers whose stories get sucked into a machine that puts them inside their own narratives. What follows is one of the most varied co-op games ever made. One level, you're in a sci-fi spaceship sequence. The next, you're in a fantasy world riding dragons. Then a cyberpunk city. Then a tiny world of rodents. Every chapter introduces new mechanics, and then moves on before they overstay their welcome. The game constantly surprises you. The co-op design means every mechanic requires both players to work together, and the chemistry between the two leads mirrors the teamwork in gameplay. The story explores themes of creative passion, fear of failure, and what it means to follow through on something you love. On Switch 2, Split Fiction runs at a locked 30 frames per second docked and around 40 frames per second handheld, with VRR smoothing things out.
Unique set of abilities to help them get to the next level. At Hazelight, we really love gameplay variety. That's why we added side stories that are...
Dragon Quest XI's is the definitive JRPG package. You play the Luminary, a young man who discovers he is the reincarnation of a legendary hero, only to have the world immediately brand him as a herald of darkness and send everyone after him. The story is a globe-trotting classic fantasy adventure, moving between kingdoms, deserts, ocean towns, and ancient ruins, each with their own characters and self-contained storylines that feed into the larger epic. The cast is one of the best in the series. Sylvando alone is worth playing the game for. The combat is traditional turn-based but refined, with a free movement system that lets you walk around the battlefield and formation bonuses that activate when the right party members are paired together. On Switch, Dragon Quest XI's runs at a target 30 frames per second at 1080p docked and 720p handheld. It also includes a 2D mode that lets you play the entire game in classic 16-bit JRPG style, which is a remarkable bonus. Resident Evil Requiem. You play Grace Ashford, a CDC investigator tracking a biological outbreak through a city being consumed by a new progenitor virus variant. The game leans more into survival horror roots than recent entries. Grace is not a super soldier. Resources are tight, and the enemy encounters require careful management. The new parasite system introduces enemies that adapt to your strategies, change behavior based on items you use, and can merge to create stronger forms. Grace has an analysis tool that lets her scan threats in real time, rewarding players who study enemy patterns. The story takes Resident Evil's lore in unexpected directions and pays off threads from several previous games. On Switch 2, the game targets 60 frames per second with an internal resolution of around 540p docked, upscaled to approximately 1080p via DLSS. Handheld, internal resolution sits around 360p, upscaled similarly. Performance hits 60 frames per second in smaller areas, but can drop into the 40s to 50s in dense exterior sections. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. You're Link, awoken after a 100-year sleep with no memory in a Hyrule that Calamity Ganon has already destroyed. The game hands you 4 abilities: Magnesis, Stasis, Bombs, and Cryonis, and then drops you in the world and says, figure it out. Every material in the environment interacts physically with everything else. Metal conducts lightning, wood burns, ice floats, fire creates updrafts. The entire game is built on this physics and chemistry system, and 120 Divine Beast dungeons, 900 Korok seeds, and 150 shrines later, you're still finding new interactions. Climbing is universal. If you can see it, you can try to reach it. The weapon durability system forces constant adaptation and creativity. On Switch 2, Breath of the Wild runs at 4K docked, upscaled from 1440p, and 1080p handheld, both at a smooth 60 frames per second with HDR. Compared to the Switch 1 version's 900p docked 30 frames per second target, this is a massive improvement. Super Mario Odyssey. The game sends you across themed kingdoms, a food-themed world, a desert world, a seaside world, a forest world, each with their own visual identity and mechanics. The core gimmick is Cappy, a hat you throw that can temporarily capture enemies and objects. You capture a bullet bill and fly through an obstacle course. You capture a T-Rex and stomp through a jungle. You capture a fish and explore an underwater cave. There are hundreds of power moons to collect, and the game hides them in clever ways, solving puzzles, finding secrets, completing challenges, and even just discovering things through curious exploration. On Switch 1, Mario Odyssey runs at 60 frames per second at 1080p docked and 720p handheld. On Switch 2, the game runs even more cleanly, with improved stability and faster loading. There's no dedicated Switch 2 edition, but the boost from the hardware makes it noticeably sharper. It's still the best 3D platformer on the platform. Red Dead Redemption on Switch 2 is one of the best redemption stories in gaming, no pun intended. The original port on Switch 1 hovered around 25 frames per second, and the resolution was rough. The Switch 2 update, which is free for existing owners, brings the game to a mostly stable 60 frames per second, using DLSS to achieve 1440p docked from a native 720p base. Handheld runs at 1080p from 540p native. You play John Marston, a former outlaw forced by government agents to hunt down his old gang members in exchange for his family's freedom. The world is a dying American frontier, open plains, small towns, desert canyons, and a Mexico that feels authentically lonely. The characters you meet along the way are the best in any Rockstar game, and the writing carries a melancholy weight throughout. The morality system affects your reputation in towns and changes how NPCs interact with you. The Undead Nightmare DLC is bundled in, adding a full zombie apocalypse alternate timeline. Cyberpunk 2077. You play V, a mercenary in Night City, a hyper-capitalist megalopolis where corporations run everything and human augmentation is everywhere. A job gone wrong leads to V getting a chip implanted in their head that slowly overwrites their consciousness with the digital ghost of a legendary rocker rebel named Johnny Silverhand. The story is about identity, mortality, and what you're willing to sacrifice. The world is impossibly dense. Every district has its own subculture, every side job has its own story, and the Phantom Liberty expansion adds a spy thriller arc that rivals the main campaign. Combat blends gunplay, hacking, and melee in builds that range from stealth netrunner to full-on tank cyborg. On Switch 2, Cyberpunk runs with a quality mode at 30 frames per second, 1080p docked via DLSS, 720p handheld, and a performance mode targeting 40 frames per second. DLSS handles upscaling throughout, and CD Projekt Red built the port themselves.
You have the manifest from the transport.
Of course I do. I'm the fixer didn't give you the job deeds.
25 of the best adventure games on Nintendo Switch and Switch 2. Whether you're picking up a Switch 2 or still on the original, there's something here for everyone. Drop a comment on which one you're playing right now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.